January 14th, 2024, at Mount Washington, began with a deceptive blue sky and the kind of crisp air that lures even the most cautious climbers into a false sense of security. We're uncovering a winter ascent undone not by a lack of gear, but by a breakdown in judgment between two professionals who should have known better. One mother ignored her husband's pleas to seek shelter, pushing their 5-year-old son into a wind tunnel that experienced climbers were already fleeing. By nightfall, the mountain would demand a price that no amount of professional accolades could pay. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means the world and helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Stick with us until the end, and if this mystery moves you, share your thoughts in the comments and pass it along to a friend. The morning of January 14th, 2024, at Mount Washington, carried a sharp, crystalline stillness that only the White Mountains can produce. For Julian and Elena Vance, this wasn't just a hike, it was a branding opportunity. Julian, a certified alpine guide, and Elena, a professional mountain photographer, had built their lives around high-altitude achievements. They had recently moved to the shadow of the peaks, seeing it as the ultimate playground for their 5-year-old son, Leo. Elena had spent weeks planning this specific traverse, envisioning a family portrait at the summit of the presidential range to showcase their mountain lifestyle. They had been planning this particular adventure for weeks, obsessively checking weather forecasts and researching photography angles. The plan was to reach the summit together as a family, take photos that would showcase their achievement, and return home with proof of their successful mountain lifestyle. The morning started with temperatures around 8 degrees Fahrenheit at the base, manageable for experts. But the White Mountains are notorious for the Franconia Ridge effect, where air masses are forced over narrow lines, creating sudden, deadly wind shears. The ridge sits above tree line for nearly 2 miles, offering no shelter from the elements once hikers commit to the traverse. Winter temperatures on the ridge regularly drop below -20 degrees, with wind chills reaching -60 or lower. At the trailhead, the forecast already signaled wind gusts up to 50 miles per hour above 4,000 feet. Experienced mountaineers were already debating whether to stay below the tree line. Several groups of seasoned winter climbers were discussing the deteriorating forecast and deciding whether to attempt the ridge traverse or choose a more sheltered route. Julian checked the barometric pressure on his watch, a habit from years of leading expeditions. He felt the subtle shift in the wind, a predatory hum that suggested a downdraft was coming. "Elena, the ridge is going to be a tunnel today," he said, adjusting the straps on Leo's specialized winter carrier. The carrier was designed for extreme cold weather with extra insulation, wind protection, and built-in heating packs. "We should take the sheltered route through the hardwood forest. We can get the photos there." Julian had limited his risks in the past, but Elena had a different drive. She considered herself experienced in winter outdoor activities. Her father had been a ski patrol member, and she had spent countless weekends as a child on the slopes. After moving to New Hampshire, she had been eager to share her love of winter sports with Leo. Elena didn't even look up from her GPS, her fingers dancing across the frozen screen. She pointed toward the peak, visible through the thinning clouds. "We have done harder climbs in the Alps, Julian. We have $10,000 in technical layers on our backs." She dismissed his caution with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Julian bit his lip, a micro-movement of hesitation his wife didn't notice. He looked at Leo, who was a bright, energetic 5-year-old who loved spending time outdoors. The boy didn't understand, and his parents hadn't properly considered, that a child's physiology makes them exponentially more vulnerable to cold exposure than adults. Children lose body heat through their heads and extremities much faster. Their smaller lung capacity makes them more susceptible to breathing difficulties in extreme cold. At the trailhead campground, Ranger Mike Stevens took one look at the family setup and immediately expressed serious concerns. Stevens had worked in the White Mountains for over 15 years and had participated in numerous winter rescues. He explained that current conditions above tree line were extremely dangerous, with wind speeds that were already approaching the threshold for safe travel. The ranger strongly recommended choosing a lower elevation hike or postponing the trip entirely until conditions improved. Elena simply smiled and showed Stevens her high-end GPS device and emergency beacon, believing that equipment could substitute for experience and judgment. What the couple didn't understand was that winter hiking with a child requires exponentially more judgment than adult hiking. The margin for error becomes virtually non-existent. They started at 8:30 a.m., with Leo secured in the high-end winter hiking carrier on Julian's back. The weather was cold, but manageable initially, and partly cloudy with light winds. They made good time on the well-maintained trail, stopping frequently for photos. Leo was pointing at icicles and asking questions about the snow-covered trees. His excitement and curiosity made both parents feel confident about their decision. The winter landscape was spectacular, with frozen waterfalls and snow-laden evergreens, creating perfect conditions for the kind of photography Elena had envisioned. Sarah took dozens of photos of Brandon and Tyler, while Brandon captured shots of Sarah pointing out wildlife to their son, documenting their progress and capturing moments that they planned to share as proof of their success. By 10:30 a.m., at 3,200 feet elevation, the family began to notice that the wind was picking up more than they had expected. The temperature remained around 5 degrees, but the increasing wind was creating a noticeable wind chill. Other hikers they encountered were mentioning that conditions above treeline were deteriorating rapidly, with several groups already turning back. A pair of experienced winter climbers warned the family that the wind on the ridge was becoming dangerous. Julian adjusted his stance, feeling the weight of the child shift. "Elena, we need to talk about the turnaround time," he muttered. She just adjusted her goggles. "We are almost there, Julian. Don't be the one to quit first." At 3,800 feet elevation, the first signs of serious trouble appeared. The temperature had dropped to 0 degrees, and the wind had increased dramatically to 35 miles per hour, creating a wind chill of -25. What had started as manageable was becoming genuinely dangerous. This elevation puts hikers in the White Mountains transition zone, where the mountain's notorious weather effects begin to intensify. The terrain here funnels air masses upward, accelerating cooling and creating sudden wind gusts. Leo was starting to fuss in his carrier. Not his usual playful complaints, but a more distressed crying that indicated he was becoming uncomfortable with the cold. Julian stopped to check on him, adjusting his face mask and activating additional heating packs. Other hikers were turning back, including a group of experienced winter climbers who had started the trail 3 hours before them. The group's leader specifically approached the family to warn them about the rapidly deteriorating conditions above treeline. He explained that the wind on the ridge was already gusting over 50 miles per hour, with conditions that were becoming dangerous even for experienced mountaineers. He strongly advised the family to turn back, emphasizing that the conditions were only going to get worse throughout the day. But the family was only 1 mile from treeline. They had come so far, invested so much time and energy. The thought of turning back now felt like admitting that they weren't capable of the mountain lifestyle they had embraced. Julian looked at Elena, his eyes pleading. She adjusted Leo's face mask as the wind picked up and checked all the heating packs. "We can handle this," she said, her voice barely audible over the rising whistle of the air. Julian felt a knot of injustice tightening in his chest. He was the guide. He knew the risks, yet the family dynamic had flipped. His expertise was being sidelined by her ambition. Leo's crying had subsided somewhat, and they interpreted this as a sign that their son was adapting. But as they climbed higher into the White Mountains' notorious death zone, would the family's determination prove more dangerous than the mountain itself? At 4,000 feet, they crossed treeline into conditions that immediately revealed the full extent of their miscalculation. The wind increased to over 50 miles per hour, creating a howling sound that made normal conversation impossible. Julian leaned into the gale, his boots seeking purchase on the granite, realizing they were now committed to a path where there was no shelter for miles. At 4,000 feet, the transition from the stunted trees of the Krumholtz to the open alpine zone felt like stepping onto a different planet. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed, a constant violent force that pushed against their chests and threatened to steal the very air from their lungs. The temperature had plummeted to -10 degrees, but with the 50-mile-per-hour gusts whipping across the granite, the wind chill sat at a lethal -40. Julian could feel the moisture on his eyelashes freezing instantly, turning his blinks into a jagged struggle. Behind him, the weight of the carrier felt like an anchor. He reached back, patting Leo's leg through the thick technical fabric. There was no movement, no playful kick, just the dead weight of a child who had stopped fighting. Elena was 20 feet ahead, leaning into the wind at a 45-degree angle, her trekking poles clicking rhythmically against the wind-packed ice. She looked like a machine. Her focus narrowed down to the next yellow trail blaze painted on the rock. Julian stopped, his boots sliding slightly on a patch of black ice. "Elena, we have to stop." He shouted, but the gale swallowed his voice before it even left his face mask. He lunged forward, grabbing her pack and spinning her around. Her goggles were frosted over, hiding her eyes, but the set of her jaw told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't seeing the mountain anymore. She was seeing the finish line. He pulled his face mask down for a split second, the cold stinging his skin like 1,000 needles. "Leo is too quiet, Elena. He's not crying. He's not moving. His body is shutting down." Julian's voice was thick, with a mix of professional terror and fatherly desperation. He checked the heating packs in the carrier. They felt like lukewarm coins against the overwhelming freeze of the atmosphere. Elena looked back at the trail they had just climbed. The tree line was visible, but the blowing snow was already beginning to erase their tracks. "It's only a mile, Julian. If we turn back now, we are walking into the wind. If we push to the summit, we can drop down the leeward side. It's safer." It was a classic mountaineer's trap. The summit fever that convinces even the best that forward is the only way out. Julian looked at his watch. 1 p.m. The sun was a pale, useless disk behind a wall of gray clouds. They were standing on a narrow ridgeline with a 1,000-foot drop on either side. The granite was covered in a treacherous glaze of rime ice that made every step a gamble. He felt a surge of hot anger. He had spent years telling clients when to walk away. Yet here he was, being led to the slaughter by his own wife's refusal to fail. Leo let out a thin, weak whimper that was barely audible over the roar of the wind. It wasn't the sound of a child who was cold. It was the sound of a body losing the ability to generate heat. A child's lung capacity is smaller. Their ability to breathe in these sub-zero downdrafts is compromised, and hypothermia can progress in total silence. Julian knelt in the snow, trying to shield the carrier with his own body. He tucked his warm hands inside the carrier, feeling for Leo's face. The boy's breathing was shallow, irregular. "He's slipping, Elena! We're losing him!" The visibility began to drop as a snow squall moved in from the north, a wall of white that turned the world into a featureless void. The trail markers, the small rock cairns that had guided them, disappeared into the swirling chaos. Normal conversation was now impossible. They were isolated in a sea of white, their high-end GPS devices struggling to find a signal through the thickening atmosphere. Julian felt the first real tendrils of panic. This was the White Mountains' notorious death zone, a place where the granite retains the cold and creates its own weather. Elena finally seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation as a sudden gust knocked her off her feet, sending her sliding toward the edge of the ridge. She scrambled back, her breathing coming in ragged, panicked bursts. Julian grabbed her arm, pulling her toward a small outcrop of rocks. "We have to find a way off this ridge," he hissed, his mouth inches from her ear. But the wind was gusting over 70 miles per hour now, strong enough to knock adults down repeatedly. The ice was so thick that their micro spikes couldn't find purchase. They were trapped in a whiteout, at minus 50 degrees wind chill, with an unresponsive 5-year-old. In their desperation, they made the final, fatal mistake. They convinced themselves that they had spotted a shortcut, a way to bypass the summit and drop into a sheltered gully. They moved off the main trail, their boots sinking into deep, wind-loaded drifts. Julian could feel his own core temperature dropping, his movements becoming sluggish and uncoordinated. His thinking was getting cloudy, the early stages of severe hypothermia clouding his judgment. Elena was breaking trail, her head injury from a minor slip earlier, causing her to stumble and repeat the same confused questions. The injustice of their situation felt heavy. They had the gear. They had the training. yet the mountain was stripping them bare. They were no longer elite explorers. They were just three cold bodies in a vast, indifferent wilderness, waiting for the fracture that would end it all. The whiteout was total, a suffocating shroud of swirling ice that erased the horizon and the very ground beneath their feet. Julian felt the world tilting as his internal compass failed, the victim of a sensory deprivation only a mountain storm can provide. Every direction was a wall of gray-white chaos. Elena was a flickering shadow just 5 feet ahead, her movements no longer precise, but jerky and frantic. She was aimlessly searching for a landmark, a cairn, or a trailblaze that had long since been buried by the rapidly accumulating snow. Julian's boots felt like lead weights. His dislocated shoulder from an earlier stumble throbbed with a dull, sickening heat that felt strangely detached from the rest of his freezing body. In her disorientation, Elena pivoted toward what looked like a stable, flat expanse of snow. She thought it was a plateau, a place to huddle and wait, but her professional eyes were clouded by the onset of severe brain trauma from her head injury. Julian, trailing behind, felt the change in the slope's vibration. As an alpine guide, he knew the sound of a hollow snowpack, the terrifying echo of a wind slab ready to fracture. "Elena! Stop! It's a slab!" He lunged forward, reaching out to grab her jacket, but the additional weight and the sharp vibration of his movement were the final triggers the mountain needed. The fracture line was instantaneous, a jagged lightning bolt of black appearing in the white snow. With a sound like a gunshot, the entire slope gave way. Julian, Elena, and the unresponsive Leo were swept into a roar of tumbling ice and rock. They were carried 75 feet down a steep gully on the mountain's north face, tossed like rag dolls in a washing machine of crushing white debris. When the motion finally stopped, the silence that followed was more terrifying than the wind. Julian was partially buried, his legs pinned by the heavy concrete-like snow. It took him several minutes of agonizing, one-handed digging to free himself, his breath coming in gasps that felt like glass in his throat. He found Elena first, buried up to her chest, her eyes unfocused and her speech a slurred, repetitive loop about reaching the summit. But Leo was gone. The carrier had been ripped from Julian's back during the tumble. He began to dig with a primal, desperate energy, ignoring the screaming pain in his shoulder. The snow was packed hard by the force of the avalanche, turning into a tomb of ice within seconds. It took 35 minutes of clawing at the earth with frozen fingers before he found the corner of the carrier. By the time he pulled his son from the debris, the battle was already over. Leo had died from asphyxiation, the weight of the snow compressing his small chest and blocking his airways. The 5-year-old was cold, his waxy skin a silent testament to the price of their overconfidence. Julian sat in the snow basin, holding his lifeless son as the temperature dropped to -25 degrees overnight. Elena's breathing became increasingly shallow as the combination of her head injury and the cold finally claimed her. She died 6 hours after the avalanche, leaving Julian alone in the dark. In a final futile act of protection, he wrapped both his wife and son in his own jacket and an emergency blanket, talking to them through the night, whispering the apologies he should have said at the trailhead. He didn't try to build a shelter. He knew the mountain had won. 2 days later, the New Hampshire Fish and Game rescue teams followed the faint, wind-scoured tracks until they reached the basin. They found all three huddled together, a frozen tableau of a family that had everything but the humility to turn back. The investigation would later reveal that their high-end gear was in perfect working order, but it was no match for the poor judgment that led them onto an unstable slope in hurricane-force winds. The tragedy became a haunting legacy in the White Mountains, a story told to every hiker who thinks their equipment makes them invincible. Julian and Elena had sought a photo to prove their mountain lifestyle, but the mountain had taken everything, leaving only a cautionary tale about the cost of a summit that was never worth a life. The tragedy of the Vance family remains one of the most sobering reminders that the wilderness does not care about your experience or your equipment. Their story serves as a haunting testament to the thin line between adventure and disaster and the heavy price of ignoring the mountain's warnings. No photo and no summit is ever worth the life of a child. If you found the Vance family's tragic journey as chilling as the mountain they tried to conquer, Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a deep dive into these mysteries. What would you have done if your partner refused to turn back in the face of a deadly storm? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. Your support allows us to keep exploring the thin line between human ambition and the power of nature. Disclaimer: this program is for entertainment purposes only. While inspired by real-world survival cases and mountain safety protocols, the events, characters, and specific dialogue depicted in this script are fictional reinventions created for dramatic storytelling. Never attempt to hike in extreme winter conditions or enter restricted alpine zones without professional training, proper gear, and the humility to turn back when conditions deteriorate. The White Mountains and similar ranges are unpredictable environments where poor judgment can have fatal consequences regardless of equipment cost.